I'm currently standing on a site in the UK that used to be a city within a city. Less than 200 years ago, if you were stood on this piece of land, you were subject to different laws than if you were stood here. And the area is centred around St. Peter's Cathedral, just like in the Vatican City, which is centred around St. Peter's Basilica. I actually went to Rome to the Vatican City this weekend to get this footage, so I really do hope my wonderful subscribers do appreciate that. And no, the topic of this video is not the City of London. In fact, it's not in London at all. The city I'm talking about today is of course York, in northern England, and the St. Peter's Cathedral is more commonly known as York Minster. The foundations of the building lay in the 7th century, but between the years 1285 and 1839, the building was part of what was called the Liberty of St. Peter, a liberty granted by King Edward I. So what did it actually look like in this closed precinct? So here's the current Minster area from above. These were the 4 gates, the 4 entrance points to the precinct. Everything else was blocked either by buildings or the 12-foot high wall that stood here. These gates are now gone, but the main entrance, which was on the south side, is still called Minster Gates to this day. And the closest resemblance of what the gates may have looked like, partially, can be seen on College Street. This is a late 16th century, early 17th century wooden gatehouse. They wouldn't have all looked exactly like this, but this is the only survivor. So this area within the walls and the 4 gates was the Liberty of St. Peter, and within this area we can see many striking similarities to the current Vatican City. Firstly, a rather unique connection that's going to blow your mind, and it goes back a long time to the origins of both sites. Before the current building and the Christian Liberty existed here, there was actually a basilica, a Roman basilica. In fact, near the south front of the Minster, you can see one of the original columns from this basilica, which was found beneath the ground here. But it was one particular day at this basilica which is so important to this story. On the 25th of July, AD 306, a man named Constantine was proclaimed emperor here, Roman emperor, in this basilica, which is commemorated by a statue close to the column. He's actually considered a major turning point in the history of Christianity, being the first emperor to allow Christians to worship freely in the empire. This allowed Christianity to become a major religion over the next 1,000 years, and it's the reason we see so many great Christian buildings like this one across the world. But here is where it gets interesting. Underneath the current York Minster is of course the remains of the Roman Basilica. Underneath the current St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in the Vatican City, is also an older Roman basilica, the original St. Peter's Basilica. And who was it founded by? None other than our very own Constantine the Great. So we actually have a direct spiritual Constantinian connection between the two also. But now a more practical connection between York and the Vatican. See, I haven't been telling you the full truth. The real name for the precinct was the Liberty of St. Peter and Peter Prison. There were many practical buildings within the Liberty. Some have survived, such as the Dean's House for the Dean of York, St. William's College, and the Treasurer's House. But one building that didn't survive was St. Peter's Prison, which stood around the western front of the Minster here. No more prison building now, but you can sometimes find Donald around here. Something of a local legend now. This is the York Minster cat, a beautiful Bengal cat, who is often just wandering around the Minster area. But why was there a prison here all the way until 1837? Well, you see, just like in the Vatican, the precinct area fell under the jurisdiction of the Dean and Chapter of the Minster, not the Mayor of York, like the rest of the city did. So just like the Vatican with the Holy See. This is why it's said to be a city within a city. Different laws, different courts, different prisons, even a different gallows for the worst criminals. Also a fun little fact here, there was one building that belonged to the Liberty that was actually outside the walls, but still very close. From the eastern gates you can see this passageway that leads to Bedden, and you can still see parts of an extremely old building. This was actually the residence of the Vicar's Choral, who became somewhat infamous in the city, as they would get drunk in the city bounds, start fights, and then run back through their personal passageway into the Minster precinct, avoiding the persecution of the city authorities. Now, authorities, another point of comparison. The Vatican's own Swiss Guard are perhaps the most famous police force in the world. But what if I told you the guards of the Minster still exist and they are far, far older? When the king granted the liberty to York Minster in 1285, a constabulary was established here. Again, constables were selected by the dean and chapter of the Minster. Just like how the Swiss Guard, formed in 1506, protect the whole Vatican area, the Minster Constabulary would also do the same, and at one point it actually was a dangerous job and a very high pressure job. But when the liberty ceased to exist in 1839, control over the extended precinct was given up to York authorities, but not all control. You see, 10 years before this, in 1829, a devastating fire had ravaged our great Minster because a Jonathan Martin had purposely started it. He was a nonconformist who believed prayer should come from the heart, not from formal liturgy. He was actually found not guilty due to insanity and lived the rest of his life in an asylum. But following this event, the dean and chapter actually placed a full-time constable to solely protect the Minster, and as of today, about 10 people are still employed by the Minster to do this same job, and they're known now as the Minster Police. In the 1930s, they actually lost their power to make arrests, but this was regained again just 8 years ago in 2017. So they have the power to arrest anyone in this Minster area to this day. Therefore, they claim to be the oldest police force in England and 221 years older than the Swiss Guard, though admittedly not quite as formidable. But this begs the question, why is York Minster not still enclosed by large walls and security checkpoints, like in the Vatican City? These days, anyone can just walk up to the Minster and take a good look at it, but really, this is something you should be grateful of. We all should be more grateful of it, even though we take it for granted, because for most of the Minster's existence, this was not possible at all. The main street leading to the West Front was only created in the early 1860s because of the Dean of York at the time, who had a great vision. His name was Augustus Duncan, and yes, he came from the noble North Yorkshire family from Duncan Park. But his vision was to open up the Minster for the city to see, like many other great European cathedrals had done. So this street, Duncan Place, was created after knocking down the rows of houses which once stood here, obscuring the view. In fact, it was only earlier in the 19th century that the gateways into the precinct and the walls surrounding the vicinity were demolished, as the Liberty of St. Peter officially ceased to exist in 1839. And here we start to see the major difference, the old precinct here in York and the current Vatican City. In 1929, the Lateran Treaty established the Holy See's sovereignty over a new Vatican City, a state completely independent of Italian rule. Edward I granted the Minster its liberty over the city of York and York authorities and the York mayor, but ultimately it was still subordinate to the Crown, and they had to obey Crown matters. In fact, there were actually quite a few of these liberties across the country at major cathedrals. York Minster's was the most unique, but it certainly was not the only one. There was actually another liberty in York itself, at St Mary's Abbey, which was the wealthiest medieval northern abbey. Most of the large religious sites across England were in fact self-governing, lots of mini Vaticans up and down the country, but none of them exist anymore. This is a sharp reminder of our history as British people and how much the very fabric of our society has changed over time.